Well, welcome everybody. Good evening on a very hot Monday night in London. We hope that you will remain cool in this room with us or wherever you are joining us from at home. My name is Sarah Turner. I'm the director of the Paul Mellon Centre, and it's always a great pleasure to welcome people here for events, to learn about projects, exhibitions and programmes. And I know we're in for a real treat this evening because we are here on what I believe is Gwen John's birthday. We already have a celebratory atmosphere and mood going. And I know that many of you are huge fans of Gwen John's work, and maybe you've already made a trip to Cardiff to see the amazing exhibition that closes very soon. We can see the 28th of June, but as you see from the slide, you've got plenty of other opportunities to see the exhibition at other venues if you can travel to do so. So really my job today is just to welcome you. For people in the room, just to say, please do go out into the ante-room if you need water or hydration. It is exceptionally hot weather and the temperature is climbing, so we want you to be comfortable. So please do go and, if you need a break or you need to go and get some water, just please help yourself and do that. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our stellar panel of speakers and experts on Gwen John, Rachel Stratton, Lucy Wood and Patrick Elliott. So Patrick, it's over to you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear? Great. My name is Patrick Elliott. I was going to say I was at the National Galleries of Scotland. I've just moved to the National Gallery in London, where I'm curator of the new Department of Modern Paintings. I'll moderate this. I wasn't that involved in the show. The show was really a production of Lucy and Rachel and my colleague Charlotte in Edinburgh. Just to give you some background on the exhibition, so you'll have to hear me for a little bit. I was doing it. We were going to do an exhibition on Andy Goldsworthy in Edinburgh at the National Galleries of Scotland, where I worked, and we were going to do it with the Paul Mellon Centre, with Yale. So we had discussions about this in 2018, 2019, and it eventually just transpired that doing an Andy Goldsworthy show in cities so far apart just wasn't going to work. But I was also at the time doing a grant application for a Gwen John painting in 2019, and noticed that Yale had a large number of Gwen John's work. So our collaboration on Goldsworthy shifted to Gwen John. That's how it started. And originally it was Edinburgh and Yale, and then during lockdown, which came in March 2020, Cardiff came on board, and a little bit later, the National Museum for Women in the Arts in Washington came on board as a fourth venue. So that's the sort of background to the show. And then I had to do the Goldsworthy show and sort of step back from Gwen John. So didn't have much involvement in it, in fact. So I'm going to be the moderator, and I'll be the one who's asking the questions. Can you remember, Rachel, how it started from your angle?
Yeah, so I think it kind of came from two directions. So there was, as you said, you were in touch with Martina at the YCBA and, said, have you thought about doing an exhibition for Gwen John's 150th? And I think, from my perspective, where I became interested in Gwen John, when I was working at the YCBA in 2020, and during lockdown, we all had to, we were all asked to do kind of talks about something interesting in the collection that we identified with two other members of staff. And I did a talk about women artists in the YCBA collection. And that's really when I I mean, I knew that it had a strong Gwen John collection, but that's when I really started to look more deeply at the Gwen John collection and, thought this is really something that the YCBA should do an exhibition about. And so I think those two things then came, Martina then, took that forward after I had left and started this partnership with you.
And Lucy, do you want to say how you got involved?
So I got involved 3 years ago. So once the partnership had been established after that, Cardiff advertised for a curator. So I joined the team in Cardiff in 2023. And yeah, I've had 3 years just working with you on this exhibition and colleagues in Cardiff as well. So I think it's very rare. I don't know, maybe you know more than I, to have 3 years to work on one show at the moment. And we're in a very privileged position that we had a partnership, so 4 museums, and we had a curatorial group. So we all met, well, at the beginning, it was once every 6 weeks on Zoom because we were all in different places. And then, yeah, I've just had this 3 years working purely on this project. So it's been a real, privilege to have dedicated time to work on one artist. And then Rachel and myself co-curated the exhibition and co-edited the book. So we spent most of last summer on Zoom. And yeah, I think my first time that I met you all properly and spent lots of time is we had a workshop in Cardiff.
Right.
Well, you'd already had one, and then when I joined we had a workshop and everyone came together and we kind of workshopped the themes of the exhibition and looked at the collection as well. So it's been a real collaboration. This is by no means a touring exhibition. So sometimes the touring exhibitions, you kind of curate an exhibition and then it gets sold as a package to another museum, whereas this is going to change venue to venue, and it was very much a working partnership with curatorial input from each of the museums, which I think has really benefited the project, because I think the story that we tell in Cardiff and how we introduce Gwen John to our audiences is going to be different to how you do in Edinburgh and how you do in Yale and Washington. So yeah, this is a good slide because this is a work from each of our collections. So we all have, it was quite an easy project to be given because by default we had quite a good body of work to begin with because we had our 4 collections.
Do you want to say something about the Cardiff collections, in fact?
So in Cardiff we have the world's largest public collection, which is over 900 drawings and watercolours and sketchbooks and oil studies, which was some of the material that she left in her, we don't know which home this came out of because she had 2 homes at the end of her life, so we don't know for certain which home this was in, possibly some in both. And this is working material. This is a studio collection. These are sketches and drawings and watercolours that she chose not to sell and not to exhibit. So the exhibition brings that collection into dialogue with paintings that are more well known. And we do have some finished oil paintings. So the painting on the left that I've included here is one of the works in our collection, and it's a favourite, and actually it's one of the public's favourite as well. We had a vote during lockdown of favourite artwork in the collection, and this was one of the highlights of our collection. So this is called A Corner of the Artist's Room in Paris, which was probably not her title. And it shows one of her studio rooms in Montparnasse on Rue de Cherche-Midi, painted around 1907. And it's got a companion piece from Sheffield Museum, and we've brought them together in the exhibition. And I think it's interesting that it's one of her most celebrated works now, but she never sold or exhibited this work. So this was part of her studio collection when she died. But do you want to talk about the Yale collection?
Yeah, so the Yale Centre for British Art's collection of Gwen John, I think the YCBA is the largest lender of oil paintings to the exhibition. so our founder, Paul Mellon, and I should say that this exhibition is one of the exhibitions that will celebrate the YCBA's 50th anniversary, because Paul Mellon, our founder, absolutely loved Gwen John. And he really began collecting Gwen John at the time when he was just building up his collection of British art. So the work that you see second from left, the woman wearing the fabulous hat, that was the first work that Paul Mellon bought, and he bought it in 1965, I believe. And that really was when he was just beginning to turn his hand to British art. So there was something about Gwen John, because he didn't collect very many 20th century artists, and he didn't collect very many women artists. But there was something about Gwen John that he deeply loved and clearly represented an idea of Britishness to him, something we can unpack maybe. And then he amassed a really stellar collection of oil paintings and works on paper, which most of which are in the show.
I think you've got the second largest collection after Wales, in fact. Is
Yeah,
it about
so
20 or 30 works in all?
Yeah, I think we've got about 30 altogether, and a lot of those just about a third are oil paintings. Yeah,
and the Tate have obviously got a substantial collection of outstanding things. I think 8 paintings, and they've been very, very generous with the loans. And then NUMWA, or National Museum of Women in the Arts, came on as the 4th venue. That was just a complete chance. I think they called from the front desk and wondered if they could have a tour when a group of their patrons came in one day, and I gave them a tour, and we ended up in front of the Gwen John, and they all drooled over it. And there's a couple in their collection, and that's how they became the 4th venue. And it is unusual to have an exhibition which travels substantially intact to so many different venues. Normally 2 venues, 3 maximum will work, but often, particularly with works on paper, the lenders will withdraw. Watch the glass on the floor. The people will withdraw their works on paper, but this was quite unusual. Pretty much all the works will travel to all 4 venues, except the Cardiff works on paper, which can be split. Do you want to sort of say how that's going to happen?
Yeah, so it's effectively a 2-year period, 2026 in Cardiff and Edinburgh, and 2027 in New Haven and Washington. So we have 2 sets of works on paper. So it will be the core paintings will travel to all of the venues, but it will be a different set of works on paper on show in New Haven and Washington, because you can't show works on paper, certainly not for 2 years. And 1 year, we've got our works on paper conservative Fiona in the front row. 1 year's almost already a bit of a stretch for works on paper. So we have got very low light levels on the works on paper in the exhibition. But one of the things about our collection is that it hasn't been exhibited that much, and we haven't exhibited it that much, and we haven't lent the collection that much. We purchased this collection 50 years ago in 1976. And because it hasn't been exhibited so much, we think that it might be one of the only collections where the colours, particularly in the later watercolours in our collection, are retained as she would have intended them and laid them down. So we know that she was using synthetic pigments in the 20s and the 30s, possibly earlier, I'm not sure. And these, which Fiona can talk about possibly more if we get into technical things, we do know that these colorants are prone to fading. And she was aware of that as well. So some of her notes, she writes fugitive in the margins. So she knew that the colors that she was choosing might fade. So we're very cautious about how, and we've thought a lot about how we exhibit these works and how we preserve them for the future. Hi.
Can I just make one, before we move on, I just wanted to say about the NIMWA collection that it's also their 50th anniversary exhibition. And that's because Gwen John was also a favorite artist of their founder, Wilhelmina Halliday, who was in the kind of 70s and 80s onwards, amassing this amazing collection of women artists. And she speaks in an interview about how Gwen John is one of her favorites.
So there's lots of anniversaries. It's in fact, it's the 150th anniversary of her birth today, and then Cardiff bought the works to mark the centenary, wasn't it? From the estate. From Edwin, was that?
Yeah, so I should say that some of the works were sold after her death, so we don't have all of the works left, but yeah, we purchased this from her estate in the 70s. It's also the 100-year anniversary of her solo exhibition, which I quite like, which would have been on now 100 years ago, so it was on in May and June at the New Chenille Gallery. When she was 50. So that's quite a nice anniversary as well. Yeah.
So that's the mechanics of sort of how the show came about. Before we go on to the sort of more philosophical issues of why we're doing it or what her work means to us, can you comment on the title of the show?
Strange Beauties.
Yeah.
So, as you can imagine, choosing a title for 4 museums was complicated.
That was the most complicated thing of the whole show, wasn't it?
It was really hard. We had Zoom title workshops. It should have been straightforward because it was translated into Welsh, but it translates quite well. So she referred to herself, in 1922, she started referring to herself as God's little artist in her notebooks. And she followed this with a seer of strange beauties, a teller of harmonies, a diligent worker. And we've co-written an introduction to the book called Strange Beauties, and the exhibition is called Strange Beauties. It's an idea that comes up a lot in her writing, and both strange beauties, sometimes in the singular, sometimes just strangeness, sometimes strange form. So it feels, when you read her writing, it felt like a very significant aspect or thought that she had in terms of how she thought of herself as an artist. I think it can be interpreted in different ways, but one of the things that we have tried to articulate in the introduction, and this is a theme that comes out in her writing, but also the extracts that she copies from philosophers, so on, that she's reading, is an idea of kind of trying to capture what's unusual or enigmatic about a subject, and look at a subject as if for the first time, so capture its strangeness.
We went through dozens and dozens of different titles. I remember we put them into an AI sort of search engine, which came up with some quite good alternatives.
No.
So what were you looking for when doing a Gwen John show? What were you both? What did you both hope to achieve? Why Gwen John?
I mean, Gwen John has always been an artist that I've been really drawn to, and I think what initially drew me to her was the fact that she was this kind of amazing woman artist, and that her work is not only was she a woman artist, but her work is so about being a woman, or about the experience of being a woman, and that it captures that across different periods of time, across different generations. Somehow people always are drawn to her work, particularly women, I think, but not exclusively, because it really seems to kind of capture something of the female experience. So that was the hook for me. But then I think once we got into the research, it was so interesting how she'd been presented. And, you know, there's been some fabulous scholarship on Gwen John, and we owe a lot to, you know, all the people who have written biographies and done exhibitions of her work in the past. But a lot of it had been done through the lens of her biography. And so as we were looking at her work, we were reading her archive, and we were, and reading the scholarship, and we were just noticing that, what we really wanted to do was think about her practice and understand what she was trying to get at as an artist. And so that was the really exciting thing I found.
Agree. I would say we talked a lot about how to do an exhibition that is chronological, because the exhibition is chronological. That was important to us, although she stopped dating her work, so it's also complicated. But we wanted to show the progression of her work, but we wanted to move away from who she was as a person, and we wanted to explore her life through the work, so that you have these different narratives that are being told. So each of the rooms and each of the chapters of the book explores what we think is a kind of key facet of her as an artist. It's not non-biographical. The life is there, but I think what this show does, I hope, or what we wanted to achieve, is to show the breadth of her art. I think showing so many works on paper really does expand. It expanded my understanding. So I think most people come to Gwen John through the paintings, in my experience of people that I've spoken to, and I did come to her through the paintings. I worked at the National Portrait Gallery before this, and love their self-portrait, which is not in the exhibition because it's too fragile to travel. And I think something that's so interesting about the works on paper is that it shows a kind of broader range of subject matter and a kind of different approach to the medium, which is obviously it's a different approach to the medium, but it's very rare that she makes drawing studies for paintings. She considered her drawings works on paper in their own right.
And she does often say that the drawings have the same value to her as the paintings. Yeah,
it was to John Quinn, was that the letter? No, or Ursula Tirrett. She said that her works on paper were quite as serious as the paintings. So this was when she was exhibiting her works on paper at the salons in Paris after the First World War. She exhibited one of her paintings of Mère alongside a set of Breton children.
Can we talk a little bit about the chronology? So she's born in 1876 and goes to the Slade in 1898, I think. No, a little earlier than that. Can you walk us through the early chronology?
Sure. So she was born in Haverfordwest in West Wales in 1876 and grew up in Tenby. She studied at the Slade School of Fine Art in the 1890s. And these paintings that we're looking at really relate to the Slade. So this is one of the most advanced art schools in Britain. She was really part of the first generation of women that received a formal art education. And we thought a lot about what she learned there and how she kind of, I think, developed the foundations of her practice at the Slade. Although she completely moves away from this style of painting, she does, you can see that she's beginning to work in close earthy tones. I think she was influenced by, actually it's really interesting to have the Whistler exhibition on now. I kind of wish it had happened before we started working on the exhibition, because I think it has made me understand Gwen John better, and seeing them, so many of those works in the flesh. So Whistler was a key influence on Slade artists of the period. And I particularly love these two works that we've got here. So a self-portrait, which is on loan from Tate, going to all four venues. Yeah, you said very generous with their loans, which is fantastic. This was painted after the Slade, and it's very different to the National Portrait Gallery self-portrait. And then on the left, right, confused. That's right. A portrait of her landlady, which is on loan from the Met. And this is such a fantastic work. It's so small. I just want to emphasize how small it is. And this painting, so it's her landlady, Mrs. Atkinson, and it was included in, I'm looking because we've got a mirror here so we can kind of see the slides. This was included in her exhibition in 1926, and it was one of the paintings that the reviewer of that exhibition pulled out and described Gwen John's ability to find beauty in drabness and described her as a modern Vermeer.
And that's around the time that she goes to Paris and studies with Whistler as well. I think that's in late 98.
So in 98, she goes to Paris and she studies at Whistler's Académie Carmen. So yeah, a key influence on her work. She comes back to London after that period and finally she embarks on a walking journey to Rome with her friend Aurelia McNeill in 1903. They never get to Rome, but they get to Toulouse, where they spend the winter and abandon the journey. And in Paris, in 1904, they head to Paris, where she lives for the rest of her life. So those are the chronological. Love this pair of paintings. So we were really keen to bring together pairs of paintings in the exhibition.
That's something that marks her work, working in series, isn't it?
You want to come in here?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that is really it's very prominent when you look at her work altogether, that she begins to work in series, and the way she begins to work in series is actually by working in these pairs of paintings. So the first one of this pair that she does is a lady reading, and for that she used a painting of the Virgin Mary by Albrecht Dürer as the she used the face of this Virgin Mary, and there are kind of covert references to her relationship with Rodin in there, particularly in the pose of the woman, which is the same pose as the monument to Whistler, talking of Whistler, that Gwen John posed for Rodin.
Do you want to just mention that she was an artist model for?
She was an artist model for Rodin. Also, she had a kind of 10-year love affair, romance with Rodin, if for anyone who didn't know that. So, and that had been one of the kind of ways in which she was looked at early in her life, but it's been a while now since she's been kind of stood on her own 2 feet, I think. But so that was the first one she did, and that painting was actually bought by the Contemporary Art Society in Britain, which was tasked with buying work because they felt that the Tate was not buying contemporary art, so they would buy up contemporary art and then they would sort of lobby to get some of that contemporary art into public museums in the UK. And that did end up at Tate. It was the first work by Gwen John to enter a public museum. And then she makes a second version where she swaps out the Dürer face for a self-portrait. And she changes some of the objects in the background. And so you can see that she's beginning to think about how different details and slightly different compositional structures change the meaning, change the atmosphere. And then this work was shown it was bought by John Quinn, who was the American collector of modern art in New York City. He was kind of amassed the biggest avant-garde collection in the early 20th century. Unfortunately, he didn't bequest it to any museum, so then it all got dissipated after his death. But he bought this work, and he became, for the rest of his life, he died in 1924, and for the rest of his life, he became an avid patron of Gwen John's. He absolutely adored her. He paid her an annuity, so he kind of funded her to make work, regardless of whether she gave it to him or not. And he shipped this over to New York, and he put it in the Armory show in 1913, which was the kind of where European modernism, it was European modernism's entrance into the American psyche, and they didn't like it initially. I mean, they liked Gwen John, actually. There's she represented something a bit more palatable for them, maybe, but there was so this work was in that show.
So, and the one on the left, it was bought, I think, by the Contemporary Art Society in 1911 and lent to a number of shows, and then given with another painting, a nude, to the National Gallery of British Art. The Tate in 1917. The Tate was only called the Tate from 1932, and it was actually a sort of a division of the National Gallery even then. But I think by the 30s there were a number of her works by the early 30s there were a number of her works in UK public collections. So she wasn't,
and US. By the 30s, also US, UK, and US.
So she wasn't unknown, but she wasn't a productive painter, though. I think there are a number of unfinished or slightly sketchy works. So there are maybe 120 or something like that.
150.
Do you reckon 150? Is that with the sketchy ones as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe a little less of the finished works. And how many have we got in the exhibition?
Gosh, it's about 200 works in total. I need to know.
The oils would be about, is that 50 or so?
It's roughly half.
Yeah, that's amazing to have got so many. Why do you think she had a career spanning nearly about 40 years. Why do you think she wasn't a productive painter?
It's really interesting because I actually think that's quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I find that quite a lot of paintings. I know it's not by some standards.
And she also was a prolific works on paper artist.
So that's about
it depends whether you count that.
3 or 4 oils a year.
It's a lot.
Quite.
I think.
Yeah. But she wasn't. Well, John Quinn, for example, he had this annuity that he was paying. He wanted as many works as he could get, and she just didn't want to part with them.
I think
she was quite fussy about finishing things. She didn't really want to let anything go.
Very fussy about finishing things. She was an extreme perfectionist, I think, and that meant that she often didn't feel that it could enter into the public realm. Mm-hmm. And so I think she was very, very critical of her own ability.
She was offered a show in 1930, I think, and in New York, and didn't take that on.
Yeah, so she was meant to have her. She'd had the only solo exhibition that she actually had in her lifetime was this one at the New Chanel Galleries in London. But she was supposed to have a solo exhibition in New York at the Farragut Galleries, which was a kind of avant-garde gallery, and she just didn't send the work. and actually, I found an advertisement in a kind of magazine for the exhibition. So it must have been really last minute that she said, "I'm sorry, I'm not sending any work," because they'd advertised it.
So she was exhibiting mainly at the New English Art Club, and then also at the salons in Paris, the Salon d'Automne, and also some of the more conservative salons, the Société des Artistes Français, and the. She was not.
She was happy for her work to be understood both within a kind of avant-garde modernist context and within a more academic tradition. So she exhibited at multiple different salons, Salon d'Automne, but also others, and she.
So you use the word modernist there. How would you define her as a modernist? I
would, and I think that's.
Did.
I did, yes.
Yes, so the plug for the catalogue there.
I think that's something that was a revelation, I think, for me in the research that I did, that I went into it thinking that perhaps she wasn't. Well, she was a modernist in the broadest sense of the term, in that she was working in the period of modernism, but when I went into it, I wouldn't have classed her as that. But then, especially looking at her works on paper, thinking about the way that she used repetition and seriality, looking at the move from this kind of empirical realism through to the later works, which are much more kind of abstracted and more interested in the surface of the canvas, and then the way that the watercolor moves around the paper. I have come to understand her as a modernist.
It's interesting, the research that was done a lot by you two. I hadn't realised that there was a chance of a show together with Marie Laurence at one point. And then I did know this, but John Quinn was hoping to introduce her to Brancusi, which looks like two people from different worlds sort of colliding, though I don't think they ever did meet. Shall we move on to some of the technical issues now, which I think is one of the chief sort of assets of the show, looking at her watercolour technique, her way of scaling things up. We've got an image here that shows the squared up, the sort of squared patterning of the canvas, and she's squared up through that process. Can you talk a bit about that, either of you?
Yeah, so this is one of our paintings of Mère Pucepin, which is in the exhibition, and this is an infrared image which Rachel Beard took. And I should say that colleagues did do lots of technical research into our paintings for the exhibition in 2004. And we've been able to kind of build on that research. But one of the things that we did learn when we were working on the project is that very few of Gwen John's paintings in public collections have had technical analysis. So each of our institutions had our paintings looked at. So we took infrareds working across our different teams, and we also worked with Tate and we worked with Ashmolean. They took infrareds of their paintings to be able to kind of come together and look at some of the works. The convalescent series, which we'll come on to later, that was a group that we looked at across our collections. But here we have her. It's an image which shows that she used a grid. So this painting is based on a prayer card. So to continue the story.
So it's a little postcard, just
it's
that sort of size.
A prayer card, tiny, this big, which we've got in the exhibition, her prayer card that she used. And so she converted to Roman Catholicism in 1913. And at the same time, around this time, received this commission from the local convent to paint a portrait of Mère Pucepin, which she basically worked on for the 1910s. And she made multiple portraits of Mère Pucepin. And yeah, on the next slide, we've got them all together. This is how they look in the exhibition. And it's just such a fascinating group because it kind of ties in with what your previous question about how is she a modernist, I think. I think across this group, you can see her completely changing her painting style. So she moves away from the fluid oil layers that she was taught at the Slade, which is a kind of more academic technique, and starts painting in these thick she calls it blobbing, the staccato brushstrokes, but also starts to really reduce her compositions and pare back her compositions. So the works on this side more closely relate to the prayer card image. And I think, although we don't know that these were painted later, she moves towards this more simplified composition, which kind of speaks to what you were just saying, Rachel, this kind of simplification of form, just the triangular shape. So it kind of, the subject matter begins to recede, and it's more about the kind of geometric arrangement of the canvas.
There's very often a triangular form in the compositional structure, isn't there?
Lucy, you should speak to that.
Yeah, we talked a lot. Triangles. When you start to look for them, they're everywhere in her work, in the works on paper, in the paintings as well. One of the observations that I love in the literature on Gwen John is Lisa Tickner referred to Gwen John's convalescence as her Mont Saint-Victoire.
Right.
So likening Gwen John repeatedly returning to the same subject to Cézanne. And I think it's just such an astute observation.
And there's a terrific essay in the catalogue by Anna Gertzner-Robbins, who's here, where she draws attention to Monet's Rouen series.
Yeah.
Which I think there were 4 of them in the Komodo collection in Paris by the late 1890s, which she could easily have seen and may have informed this kind of approach that she had.
Yeah, I guess the artist that she was influenced by, Whistler, Cézanne, worked in series. So I think it kind of roots her in a particular tradition. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think she would have hung the works like this. So we did have kind of debates about how to hang the show, you know, what's a set and what's a series, and would she have exhibited works as series, and would she have used the word series? So it's complicated, but it is fascinating to look at.
How was she sort of financing things, the whole, if she wasn't selling much? I know she was getting the annuity from Quinn, but did she have private money?
No, she didn't. So she initially she had some support from her father. Her mother died when she was quite young. So and her father supported her up until it was 1904, wasn't it? That he came to visit her in Paris, and she was wearing a dress that she had made based on a painting by Renoir, was it? Manet. And he disapproved of this dress, and that was it for her. She said, well, you know, I want to live my life the way I want to live it. So she cut herself off from him, and from that moment on, she was financially independent, and she was hard up a lot of the time. I mean, so from 1904 to 1912, which is when Quinn starts paying her the annuity, she funded herself by modeling. And that's how she came into Rodin's orbit. But she also modeled for many women artists in Paris at the time. And so she was funding herself like that. And then when she got the annuity from Quinn, she was able to slowly stop modeling.
But the last 10 years of her life, because he died in, what, 25, was it?
24, yeah.
And she died in 39. She would have been living through the sales of her work, do you think?
I mean, she must, I presume, but and kind
she had
of
a pretty simple life, though.
Very simple. I mean, she did get increasingly hard off, and she, you know, people. There are lots of letters about friends sending her gifts of clothing and that sort of thing. So she was living a very, very simple life. And you can see that in the materials, which Fiona, who's sitting here, who's the paper conservator at National Museum of Wales, did some amazing research on, which is also in the catalogue. You know, her materials, she starts working on paper from the Grand Magasin de Louvre in Central Paris, the department store. She goes there and she uses the pen and paper, the ink and paper there, and presumably that's partly, at least, because it was freely available. And you also start to see her working on the backs of advertisements, of cardboard boxes, so you can sort of see her poverty kind of coming through in the materials.
Shifting on now to the watercolours, and there's hundreds of them. They weren't, in fact, I think, on the Cardiff website when we started. And there are sort of 800 or 900 of them?
They are now. They're being reorganised currently. But the images are on the website, which is brilliant. So we've got a brilliant photographer, Rianne Israel, who I'll just mention, who's been working on the collection, and it's such a fantastic resource to have the images available, because it makes such a difference with people being able to access them. So here's 3 images of some works from our collection. So probably the largest group of works in our collection are studies in church. And she would go to the church and draw congregants.
Sitting in the back row.
Sitting at the back. And focusing on the kind of details. You see the nuns' clothing and the orphans' clothing again and again, and the ladder-back chairs. She has particular motifs that she returns to. But I think these are interesting because you obviously have the progression. So she probably drew in dry media in church most often, although possibly watercolour later, the outlines we were saying earlier. And took her studies home and worked up multiple versions in different colours and experimented.
So these would have been done in the studio?
I think so. I mean...
And there looks to be some kind of copying or tracing going on as well. I think the two on the left look identical. What's the process there? Is that holding them up to a window?
Fiona, did we look at these ones for tracing? No, not these ones. Just had to check.
But the two on the left, with a quick look before, look almost identical.
Yeah, so I think there is some evidence. Well, definitely earlier on in her career, so when she was living in Montparnasse, she talks about tracing. And then we do think there is some evidence of tracing later, and holding works up to a window and copying the outlines. And you can see in our collection evidence of marks left on the following page. So interesting.
Yeah, there's never, as far as I know, any effort to make an oil painting of this subject. It dominates the works on paper boxes, but there are no ditto. There are lots of landscape drawings in and around Meudon in the woods there, but very few paintings of the same subject. Why do you think that was? Why did they split into two different types, you think?
Yeah, do you want to come in? Well, I think, you do see a different range of subject matter. And I think this is clearly a kind of out of the studio subject, because she's in church, whereas the paintings are more formal portraits of models posed in her room. So there's a kind of practical element, but also something about the swiftness of watercolour. I think it captures something. They have a very different quality, the works on paper, which I think is interesting. It's not a preparatory stage for painting.
No, it doesn't look. That's right. So we're moving on to the convalescent here. There's, I think there are 11 of this. Is it 7 or 11 of this particular?
11.
And we don't know who the sitter is. The sitter posed for about 60% of the oil paintings, and we don't, or with a sitter in them, and we don't know who she is.
Yeah, so as you say, she was the subject of over 60 of the oil paintings, and she's only referred to by Gwen John as a neighbor in Meudon. She never mentions her by name. She never mentions her in any other way. So, and she never even mentions her as a paid model. So we don't even know whether she, presumably, I hope she was being paid, having sat that many times. But she was presumably a person local to her studio in Meudon, which was where she moved in 1911. And what's interesting about these works, when you see them in the exhibition, well, not in yours, these ones are in a slightly different room, but there's a room where it's just works of this woman, this model. And you can see that actually at this point, they are portraits, but she's not trying to capture any kind of individual likeness, individual character. She's really using the model as a vehicle for experimentation with painting. And she talks about wanting to develop and get to grips with the rules and problems of painting. So the model really becomes secondary to her interest in working with the media.
Nicely put. And they're all tiny, aren't they? I think the tallest one is probably about 55 centimetres tall, something like that.
Yeah, something that was really interesting is when you have lots of them together like this, the difference in scale. Scaling her subjects
The Poussin ones are probably the largest.
The
and
Poussin.
The Pilgrim ones are the largest.
The 3, yeah. But by about 2 centimetres, I think, aren't they? They'll be about 80 centimetres tall. And there's another series with the same woman, different cat. But that's part of a longer series. There are other drawings of the same series. And are they all in the show?
Yeah, so this is part of the room that we were just talking about. And I suppose this is an example where you do have her drawing her model in preparation for painting. But I think this is interesting because it shows how she worked in sections with the unfinished painting, which is quite unusual, I think, and really interesting. This is obviously an abandoned painting. And she drew her cats, made many watercolours of cats, but you don't see cats very often in the paintings. So yeah, this is a really loved series in the exhibition, so I put them in here.
Another interesting thing, I was reading Anna Gretzner Robbins' essay earlier, and just drawing attention to how similar they are to some of Cézanne's late works, particularly the hands, the way they're held at the bottom there. And just an aside about dating, you can see they're all circa 1920. That's guesswork, informed guesswork, but because she didn't date her works from about 1910 or exhibit them consistently or with the same titles, it's pretty much guesswork what the dates are and also how her style develops or doesn't develop over the years. This shows the top image shows the lip. That's a tiny little detail of the lip, and then I think the bottom one is one of the little orange curlicues that are on the wallpaper behind. But just shows you the incredibly dry technique that she had, the dry medium, very spare with the sort of oil medium. Do you want to comment on that for a bit? It's unique as far as I know, a little bit like Vuillard, but much, much drier, quite cakey. And it's all sort of started to crack, and you've got these holes developing in the fabric of the paint.
Yeah, so these photographs were taken by Rachel Beard, so it's really nice to have who's here, and nice to have kind of close-up images. And I think they both show how kind of that single brushstroke for the orange circle is so lovely, and also the lips. We tried to recreate the ground that she paints on in our workshop. We weren't very successful.
No.
So she had a kind of recipe that she would create a white ground by mixing chalk and animal glue, just checking, before applying paint to, and she had these blobs, these kind of bubbles that formed. And I think where we got to is that was formed by vigorously mixing the chalk and glue.
I think that's what people think, yeah, doing it consistently and reproducing that seems to be harder than
So we couldn't manage to do it no matter how vigorously we mixed it.
And from the back of the paintings, you can often see right through them, can't you? It's quite an unusual technique that she's got. Moving on to, do you want to comment?
So then we have an exhibition in the room in the exhibition called Harmonies of Colour, and these are 2 works that are in that room. And this is the moment in the exhibition, I think, where we've brought together, you see a quite an interesting relationship between the paintings from the 20s. Dating is very difficult. I should say that the dating arrangement that we arrived at was circa means plus or minus 5 years, and we're not sure, but we do think that she started working with this model in around 1923. Right. And you can see that she's using a very different color palette. She's been using the kind of cool grays and blues prior to this, and she starts using these kind of purples and greens in the paintings, which are so beautiful in the flesh. So you do really have to see those works.
I think one of the really interesting things, once you kind of step away from trying to create a chronological progression, what I think is really interesting about Gwen John is she's very responsive to the subject. So with this woman, with the mulberry dress model, her technique changes, and it may be because, you know, she's starting them later, but it may also be because the model and the clothing that she'd put the model in kind of warranted a slightly different technique and a slightly different palette. So she's really kind of using the subject as a jumping off point to then kind of think about technique and colour.
Do you have any idea how many sittings these would have taken? Is it sort of 10, would they have taken a couple of months, or were some of them, do you think, painted over a couple of years? Is there anything in the correspondence that gives a hint of that?
There's no, you go ahead.
Well, I don't have a great answer for this question. It's really hard to know. There is a letter where she said a painting ought to be done in one sitting or two at most. But this is also a life's work, and she probably evolved her methods and her sittings over time. So it's hard to know. She certainly went back to paintings later. Yeah.
We're just coming up to the hour. That's the final room. What a fabulous room it is. And the show's ending on
So the show
Sunday, isn't it?
closes on Sunday, which is very sad, but it doesn't finish because it goes to Edinburgh. So we've got many more works in the presentation, but if we're at our hour, perhaps we can look at them in the Q&A as well. So yeah, I suppose we come on more to the works on paper because many of the works in our collection are from the later years. So if you click once more, I'm not sure why it's done that, but yeah. So this is in the room about colour, these works in the exhibition. And this is really special, this work here. So this is the only instance that we know of where she's using her numbered system on a watercolour. So yeah, we can talk about that a bit more in the Q&A possibly. So we have...
Have you managed to decode that?
No. I was sure that we would.
For everyone's information, she used a numbering system which we think relates to colours or tones, but it remains a mystery what that...
There are a lot of things that remain a mystery, though, aren't there, about Gwen John?
Yeah, but I think what we show in this section of the exhibition is that she was... her approach to colour is incredibly technical. So you both have these very poetic colour notes. So I like this example here where you have the kind of mixture of a kind of poetic colour note with a list of the colours that she's using, but also this kind of very analytical approach to colour as well. And she's reading colour theory, and yeah, that's kind of explored in her notebooks in this section of the exhibition. But do you think we should
That's
should we pause on this slide and go to questions, and then we can come back to
I'd
it?
like to just ask the two of you a final question, which is what you think you've learned from doing the exhibition. What you started off thinking, what you ended up thinking.
I think I started off thinking that I knew where this exhibition was going, or what I wanted to say about Gwen John. And what's been great, I think, is that through looking at the work, I have come up with more questions than answers. And that's, to me, that's the mark of a great artist, that she's just, there's so much more to discover about her work, I think. The way she worked and why she was doing certain things. I think once you start looking at them more closely, you kind of it becomes more and more of a mystery.
Yes.
Similar to that, and I was a little bit daunted by the fact that we were going to have 6 curators working on the exhibition, and there's already been there was an exhibition by Alicia Foster, a brilliant exhibition that opened the month I started. So I was like, how are we going to do a major exhibition? But actually, what's been fantastic about working on this is we've got 9 writers in the book, and we were worried that we would have to do a lot of editing because there would be a lot of repetition between the essays. And actually, when they came in, there really wasn't. And everyone was looking at quite a different theme and approaching this from a different angle. And I found it quite heartening because it confirmed the fact that, and there will be more in the future, scholars in the future will work on Gwen John and say something new. And I quite like that there's space to explore avenues, and we haven't done it all.
But it was the first retrospective since the Barbican show of the late 80s, I think, wasn't it?
So there have been exhibitions. There was a major exhibition in 2004, which was a joint exhibition with Augustus John.
That was Tate Britain, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that came to Cardiff. And then Alicia Foster put on an exhibition in 2023, which showed Gwen John alongside other artists. So this is a solo
was Paris,
exhibition.
Really, wasn't it?
London and Paris. So this exhibition is a solo exhibition. That was very important to us, that we wanted her to have an exhibition on her own. And it's big. There's about 200 works in it as well. So it's a large retrospective that includes works from all stages of her career.
Great. I think you've answered pretty
fun.
much every question going. Can we open it up to the audience here for any questions?
Please wait for the
Eva? I
mics.
think you've got one just
thank you, that was really wonderful. But I'm really interested as well in this idea that it is the same exhibition, but it's going to these 4 different places and it's going to change as it goes. And so I wonder if you could maybe talk just a little bit more about that and what it means to have an exhibition, which I presume the title isn't changing and the kind of the main emphasis, but that sort of curatorial process and how much each of your individual institutions are then having an impact on what happens in the individual spaces, if you know that already.
Yes, so the core of the exhibition is the same in that, so, Lucy and I worked very closely. As Lucy said, we spoke probably every day, multiple times a day for a few years. So the kind of themes and the core of the works, like all the paintings are the same, most of the paintings. The works on paper have to change because of the light sensitivity. But beyond that, there's also the fact that, it's really interesting to have done this exhibition about Gwen John with an international partnership, because in Britain, Gwen John is this kind of national treasure. And in America, she's very little known now. So the National Museum of Women in the Arts and the YCBA have been thinking about how we introduce her, really, or reintroduce her to American audiences. So that's been something that we've slightly kind of tweaked some of the interpretation.
In what sense? That's interesting.
Well, so for instance, I think the opening panel in Cardiff, I think people going into that exhibition probably have some idea of who Gwen John is, whereas in the YCBA exhibition, we will kind of open with a statement about the fact that she became hailed as this figure of the new woman, and that she kind of focused on women throughout her work, throughout her life. Those are kind of things
That's something we haven't really mentioned actually.
Yeah.
all the paintings are of women.
Almost
that's
all,
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just really nice that there's kind of this body of work that gets adapted, and we all kind of work together, and we have this group, so we kind of workshop against each other. But so Rachel and I worked closely, and then we've worked with curators at all of the venues as well, who have all had creative input, and the book is a product of all of our organisations, which is really nice to do, actually. Like, if you're just doing an exhibition catalogue, which you author, and it has to be an overview of the project, you can't, I think, sometimes go into so much depth, but it meant that we could each go deep into one theme. So I wrote about religion and philosophy, and Rachel wrote about her reception and international reception. And those aren't themes you kind of plunge into with an overview. So we hope that the book will have a life after the exhibition as well. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
I've been able to visit this exhibition on a number of occasions, and many of my friends have gone multiple times. And I'd firstly like to compliment you on an excellent presentation of this artist's work, at least in Cardiff, and it's her technique, which certainly I found very impressive. But I'd like to pick up on something you started off with, which is there's a gender difference in appreciation, in that you mentioned that you said captures women's sensibility, and certainly from the people I know who visited this, women seem to relate to this much better than most of the men. Would you like to comment on why, having immersed yourself in her work, that might be?
Good question.
Do you want to? It was only because, I mean, I could, but because you said that at the beginning, which I thought you put so beautifully.
So
Neat. That was
yeah. So I think that, so I'm going to answer this in part by speaking about the way that her work is represented in a novel by Margaret Forster called Keeping the World Away. It's a fictional novel, and it follows one painting by Gwen John. We don't know which one. It could be a made up work, but we know that it's an interior. And over the course of the book, multiple, I think it's maybe 3 or 4 different women in different time periods come to own this work, and it comes to mean something to them, and it kind of speaks to them in their very different time periods, in their very different lives and situations. And I think that there is something about the way that Gwen John captures the I don't want to say the mundane, because it's not mundane, but the ordinary, the everyday, but she's doing it in a way that kind of gives weight and importance to the objects of the everyday. And I think that somehow speaks to women who are, I don't know. I actually don't really know.
She's not doing the male gaze, is she?
It's so much about
the interior life.
She imports so much weight and importance into these objects that are hers, that you come to feel a kind of emotional attachment to them. And I think there's something in that is...
So do you think... Do you think if you didn't know anything about Gwen John or the history of art, and you came to the pictures, do you think you'd be able to tell that they were by a woman?
I think so.
What about We Are, though? Because there's a strong rapport between her work and We Are. Or even Morandi. I've often wanted to do a show, or at least a display, united all three.
Yeah.
Very similar technique and colour range.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not sure what I would say about them. I don't know if I've looked enough. But I think what I would say, and that what I liked about what you said earlier, Rachel, is that her subject is women from the beginning, from the really early works. So the first painting that we have in the exhibition by her, the landscape at Tenby, it wasn't part of the presentation, depicts women. And that's her subject until the end. So you only have to just kind of flick through our book to see that that's her interest, and it's a sustained interest at this time. So
And she kind of captures the interior world of these women. She's not just making portraits of women. She's giving you a sense that there is this interior life that you do not have access to. And I think that comes across in the interiors as well. And you know, maybe that is something that women, that appeals to many women, that, you know, this idea of having this interior world that is yours and it cannot be kind of imposed upon by the outside.
Yeah, that's something we talked a lot about, the kind of how these paintings function. So they're both these sort of modernist Mont Saint-Victoires, and they're also portraits of women, but she doesn't name the woman. There's a distance. The surface becomes a distance in the end. So it's like keeping us away.
Sorry.
We've got a question from online, from David Wotton. He says, an independent art historian on British art. And David asks, could the panel talk more about Gwen John in a European context, particularly in terms of her aesthetic relationship to Rilke, Rodin, and possibly Modest Becker? So I don't know if you have thoughts on that kind of wider European network of artists and cultural figures.
Rodin. There are a lot of rapports, in fact, between Rodin's watercolours and her watercolours, which the exhibition doesn't go into. Rilke, I think, was important in terms of his philosophy, his poetry. Painters, that's more difficult. Anna in her essay talks about Cézanne, Monet, and also we know about Marie Laurencin, for example. But she doesn't have, and obviously there's Augustus John. He would be an interesting one. I think if you had sort of flipped over postcards of Augustus John and Gwen John, and you didn't know who they were by, and you said woman or man, I think you would come to you'd get 100% on those. His work does look masculine, and her work does look feminine. But she's very much a one-off. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, one of the things that we wanted to do in the exhibition, or in the books, so because this is a solo exhibition, we don't have comparative works, and also Alicia Foster has done such brilliant work in terms of situating Gwen John within kind of artistic networks in London and Paris. But what we do see through Anna's essay, and I've looked at in mine, is that she was going to the Louvre when she was in London. She was going to the National Gallery. She was visiting exhibitions. In 1904, she described going to, there was an exhibition of French medieval and Renaissance art that she describes as magnificent. So the painting of the lady reading earlier is based on a Virgin Mary by Dürer, and it also draws on Annunciation imagery. So she's taking from lots of different places, I think. And yeah, we've talked about Cézanne a lot, but I think Cézanne and Whistler are just kind of
She doesn't
key.
have an artistic peer group, does she? She's not clubbable, I think, in Paris.
She's not clubbable, no. She doesn't have a kind of social life around her practice. She is quite plugged into this kind of women artists network. So she, for instance, became friendly with Hilda Flodin, who was a Finnish artist. I might be pronouncing her surname wrong since she's Finnish. And they used to kind of go drawing together in the woods. They also are known to have had at least one kind of sexual encounter together. And there were other artists that many of whom she modeled for, many of whom she met through Rodin, but that she was part of this network, but they didn't really become a social circle. She maintained very strong friendships with the artists that she met at the Slade, really, yeah.
Because that's how many artists in Paris in the 20s and 30s would have made a living. They would have formed little groups, sort of sub-cubist groups or futurist groups or whatever, and sort of realist groups in the 20s and 30s. But she was never, apart from showing in the salons, she was never part of any separate group which could build its own identity, which would also be a vehicle for commercial sales.
It's not so much a question or a comment. Oh, sorry. But just going back to your question about why women prefer Gwen John, it seems to me that there is a bit of an elephant in the room when looking at all of her pictures of women, which is that if you do put them into a larger context, particularly a French context, but also a British context at the time, what are we looking at? We're looking at pictures by Philip Wilson Steer and Sargent where women are decorative objects in fancy costume, basically. And when we look at what Picasso and Matisse are doing at the same time, we're looking, and many, many other artists, of course, too, we're looking at largely female nudes or women who are exposing their bodies in some sort of way. I mean, I personally don't agree with Lisa Tickner about Mont Saint-Victoire. I think Cézanne is very important for her, but in different ways. In one way is that certainly the portraits of Madame Cézanne, which she did admire and also know, are very somber pictures of women. They are not decorative. They're very similar to the kinds of pictures that she did after 1910. And so for me, it's always been because I'm not embarrassed. I'm not confronted by something that I don't want to see in a painting. And I'm not prudish. I'm not at all prudish, but I'm just kind of bored with all of that. So that would be my answer. And you may, of course, disagree.
That's really nice.
Probably a very simple question, but why didn't she date her work? And was that expected, or is it because she thought that no one would try to put them back in order posthumously? It's date her work.
It's a good question, and I'm not sure that there is it's not a simple question. So I'm not sure there is a simple answer to it. Perhaps on one level, they wouldn't, it was difficult for her to, dating a work means, it's done, it's ready to go out in the world. And maybe there was an element of her not really wanting to release those works. But maybe because she did return to some of them, and she certainly returned to the subjects.
They're not often signed, are they?
They're not signed either. And I mean, and she we say she stopped dating her works, but she rarely did put a date on them. I mean, I don't think she ever put a date on them. We know the dates of some of them because they were exhibited at the time, but it was just never a practice that she entered into.
But also lots of the works in the exhibition are from our collection, and they stayed at home, so they're not titled or dated or signed because she never parted with them. The journals. That's one of the things that's been really great about having such a long time is being able to spend time reading, and you can kind of trace a development of what she's thinking about through the dates in the journals. There are some instances where, I say some, very, very few, a couple of instances where she'll write a note and then a sketch, and then I've matched up the sketch with one of the watercolours in our collection, which is nice because then you can date the watercolour to 1925 when it's not dated before.
I think one reason is that she didn't have a dealer. A dealer would often ask this happened with Joan Erdley, for example. I've done some work on her. And it's the dealer who'd want, when they're submitted for an exhibition and to go in the catalogue, they want to make a list of them, they want titles, they want the signature in the corner. She didn't have a dealer, so didn't need to do that.
I think also, sorry, just quickly, what is interesting though is that so later in her life, from 1926, she developed a passion for a woman, fellow congregant at work called Vera Umansov. And she would write these very long letters to this woman who eventually said, this is getting too much. Can you not do that? And so instead, every Monday, she would give Vera a work, a watercolor or a work on or a graphite drawing. And she always dated the she put the date that she'd given the work. So she did sort of feel that dates had this kind of ceremony to them in a way that, perhaps she didn't really need to kind of have that ceremony if she wasn't exhibiting them.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to the color theory that you mentioned because I was super intrigued by it. So, and I remember one of the paintings, the color palette changed. So what kind of color theories was she into? Was there any particular change of her perception of the colors throughout the course of her career? Any comments really, I would love to hear.
Thanks. Such brilliant questions. Thank you. That was really interesting. Fiona, do you want to... No, two on the spot. I'm aware that I've got experts in the room. So I think the thing to say about colour is that she was reading colour theory, and that's fascinating. So we've got an exercise book in the exhibition in which she's copying out extracts from the French colour theorist Chevreul, who was the kind of most influential colour theorist at the time. And we know that she was kind of interested in his theories. He was interested in how colours change in appearance. So our perception of colour when they're placed side by side, which I think is interesting when you're thinking about complementary colours. And she also had a disc, which we haven't identified. And she writes about it in a letter. And we've got one of the discs in the exhibition, not hers, but we've borrowed a Chevreul book, which kind of gives an example of the type of disc that she might have had. So it's a book with his theories, and it has a pop-out disc. And this is where I'm a bit embarrassed that I kind of begun the job thinking that I would really understand the code, and I don't. But she describes this very complicated disc that had 85,000
different complementary
arrangements of colours, and she used it for figuring out the complementary or successive colour of every colour or tone.
The short answer is you should have a chat with Fiona over a drink afterwards.
There's going to be drinks afterwards, and Fiona's written an essay in the book. Sorry to put you on the spot. It's just she talks so eloquently about this subject, about Gwen John's use of colour in the works on paper. But one of the things that I like is that it's both very technical, and I was saying that earlier, but also really suggestive and poetic. And some of the notes in our collection, we've got some of my favourites, and they're towards the end of the exhibition if you've been, and they're just they're tiny drawings of primroses. And they're very simple drawings. They're quite far towards the end of the PowerPoint. And on the reverse, she writes, violet dress, green pinafore with yellow spots. So often in her church studies, she uses kind of plant names or associations with the natural world. It's actually later than these ones, but here they are. They're in the showcase, tiny primroses. And the violet dress, green pinafore with yellow spots is clearly what the picture is of when you look at it. And elsewhere, there's one that I like with a girl with a vermilion bow, a child in church, and she just writes, child with a vermilion bow on a gold ground, quiet happiness, a smile. So I think that is linked to Rilke, some of these kind of poetic associations and the way she talks about colour. So both very, I think it sort of speaks to I'm interested in the fact that she is a kind of figurative artist, but her work is by no means simple or literal. It's often very kind of symbolic and poetic.
Just the end of that question.
Yeah.
Great. I've been. No, I'm not answering it. I just the bit I've wondered about, given the dating issue, is there that distinct colour shift? Because the way it's hung in our exhibition, you do suddenly go into this room of mulberry and purple and red. And do we think that there was that distinct colour palette shift? Or you were suggesting perhaps it's to do with the sitter?
Well, I think, I mean, I do think that there is a general move, like she's definitely not using that kind of palette early in her career. So yeah, there is a kind of general progression towards more colorful palette. But I do think you're right that actually, it's not a sudden shift, because some of the works of the convalescent model, so for instance, there's a work that is called The Pilgrim. We have one, and then National Galleries of Scotland, I'm pointing to you, but you're not that. But anyway, you were that, have another version of it. And those works are, we think, probably quite late in the series of works of the convalescent model, so probably mid-1920s. So she's probably doing the Mulberry Dress series and the convalescent model sort of at the same time, but she's using quite different palettes, and I keep on being quite struck by that one of the last letters to Ursula, where she sets out that list of colours, where we don't know if she's painting at all anymore, but how out of 15 of them, 11 or so are either pink, purple or red. And so I did wonder if there is a trajectory towards that.
Note where she writes, which I lots of this is kind of piecing together with the evidence that you have, but she writes in 1923, paint as you do your drawings. And I do think that, this starts at this time to work with this model and use these kind of mulberry colours is interesting.
I think it is 7 o'clock. And I gather am I correct in thinking there are drinks?
They most certainly are.
Downstairs. Excellent.
Beautiful timekeeping.
Can we finish then by thanking Rachel and Lucy for an amazing exhibition as well as talk.
And thank you to Cornellon Centre.
Thank you so much, panellists, Rachel, Lucy and Patrick. It was such a revealing and generous discussion. I always just love hearing the research and the work behind an exhibition, and it's such a testament to all your hard work, because it's such an amazing event, and I look forward to seeing it in another iteration. Hopefully get up to Edinburgh this summer. It's a really good excuse to travel and go and see the show in another format. So the centre's open till 7:30 this evening. We encourage you to come and have a drink with us for more conversation with the panellists and together, and have a bit of refreshment before